7 writing tips you need to crush your thesis. Number 1, it sounds obvious, but actually have a plan in mind. Break your actual thesis down into manageable bits, down into manageable chunks for your writing time. Thinking you're just going to stand there and go, I'll start writing, causes a lot of anxiety, causes a lot of stress, and it actually causes writer's block. So what I mean by a solid plan is you know what you are aiming to write in each of these chapters. You have some sort of idea. You can use different theses examples to formulate some sort of plan as to how you're going to go in attacking your thesis. That's the mindset I used to use when I did mine, is how am I going to attack my thesis? That's the mindset I had when I was doing my thesis, and I looked at it as kind of like a house analogy. I look at the different building blocks and how am I going to convey my message in each of these chapters or each of these chunks. And the biggest thing is actually have that plan discussed with your supervisor. So keep that in mind. Number 2, once that plan and the obvious plan is in mind, then start to break it down into chunks and actual actionable chunks that you would do in a day, for example. And what I mean by this is a outline, a skeleton framework. Now what I did was, I know there's so many different writing tools now, but when I was using Microsoft Word, the navigation page, and I'll put it on the screen if I can find it, is what I used in order to make the skeleton of what my thesis would be. Based on a solid plan and kind of the flow, I then broke that down into actual bits that should go here, a diagram here, discussion here, some introduction, some references about this here. Once that's there, then you've got an outline, a framework, then you can start to build. So having an outline is probably, out of all of these 7 points, is probably for me one of the biggest game changer in terms of developing my thesis, and hopefully yours too. Now third, when it comes to your actual thesis, is actually understanding why you are writing it, and more importantly, who you are writing it for. A lot of people get this habit of perfection naturally, but you got to remember the goal of your thesis is actually to get your examiner to verify that you know your stuff and to articulate a story that they can read, that they can verify, and you're able to defend. It's not going to be perfect. I can look at my thesis now, which is over there, it's got a lot of dust on it actually, but I could look at it and find tons of mistakes now. It's not supposed to be perfect. It's supposed to be a cohesive and coherent story that is well articulated enough to get your examiners to understand what your PhD was and enough for you to be able to defend what your work is. So make sure you're writing with that in mind. So the flow, breaks in the text, the diagrams, whenever you're writing, keep that in mind that this is for the examiner. So you're understanding that they're going to read this and then they can understand the flow, great, you're on to a winner. Number 4 is all about clarity and simplicity. What I mean by this is that we naturally have the tendency to build actual jargon, make convoluted sentences and all of these things that make it very, very truncated when you're trying to articulate a story. Look at the greatest theses and the greatest papers. They get to their point and they had a very beautiful balance with terminologies that they need to use, but not dumbing it down that is for the layman, because it's actually for your examiner. Remember point 3, knowing your audience. To make sure you're going about your thesis in terms of how can I articulate my point or convey my findings in the best, most accurate and concise manner without having to add too many words. Remember, naturally we think, oh, the bigger the thesis, the better, but then that's just inefficient. That's just, truncated. It's not the right way to go about it. Just because your thesis is that big doesn't mean it's the best research ever. No, if you're able to articulate it in a great way and it's less words, that shows you're a much better writer, a much better academic writer. Number 5 is what I like to call in situ feedback. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to send it to your supervisor, but get your colleagues or get other people to read it and see that they can understand the flow. They're not, oh, that is a bit disjointed, doesn't really make sense. Because naturally, because it's going to be probably the biggest document you will ever write in your life, generally speaking, you will add in words. Your brain will read it and add in words, because you know what you're trying to say. To get, whether it's your roommate, whether it's your partner, whether it's your colleagues in the research industry, get them to read a page because they might not have the time to read a whole chapter. So keep that in mind that whenever you're writing and you make some decent progress, just get somebody to read some of your recent work. You can get some initial feedback to improve your overall draft before it goes to your supervisor. So at this point, I recommend you do straight away because it's so difficult later on. And it's a notion of keeping your references organized. Now, you might want to use a citation manager or reference software. That's fine. There's so many different ones. But the premise above that, whichever one you use, is to get it organized early on and get it organized on a paper document. Because I'm a believer that sometimes you might have issues with the software and you've lost all your references. So at least you have some sort of an idea of some sort of kind of document where you have all the papers. You can just, put it in alphabetical order and make sure there's all the relevant information you need in order to reference it. You might have your own, Notion database or whatever it is, but have some sort of place where your references are organized. Anything that's in your thesis isn't missing. One of the feedbacks I had in my revisions after my Viva was I referenced some work, but it actually wasn't in my references later on. I had to go try and find what that is because all I saw was the name, and it's a bit convoluted to try and find that reference. So make sure you are organized early on. It's going to make your revisions and your writing in terms of your thesis revisions a lot easier. And lastly is accept and understand and be prepared for the amount of revisions you will make in your thesis. It is a joke. I remember my document was document 52, the version 52, in terms of the one that got submitted to the examiner. Now the reason I'm mentioning that, it sounds obvious, yeah, of course I'm going to get revisions, but sometimes we don't have the mindset when we are writing because we spend a week trying to finish something where actually it was better if we send it like that to get revisions and then we can finish it off later. So this is different to feedback because these are revisions you're going to get naturally, most likely from your advisors, from your supervisors. So be prepared that you want to get a good enough draft to them so they have time to read it and then send it back to you. Keep that in mind whenever you're writing. You got to remember, a lot of these tips I'm showing today are things you should have in your mind whilst you're writing to make life easier. Whether it's a feedback, whether it's the revisions, whether it's, actually knowing your audience. All of these will help you to write more efficiently and more faster and be able to make much more progress. Be prepared that you're going to have a lot of revisions. So don't worry that you're not trying to make this draft perfect. You just need to be good enough to convey the story in order to get revisions back to modify and improve it. So guys, those are some helpful, I hope, tips to help you with your thesis in terms of visualizing what you need to go in your mind in order to write a lot better. If you want to know the writing tool that I would recommend right now, if I was to do my PhD, it is Yomu.ai, and I made a whole video about its breakdown and its features. You can find it over here. If you want to subscribe, find it over here, and I shall see you in the next one. Take care.